A big welcome to our Japan Society of Boston. I believe not necessarily our first. We've definitely done poetry events in the past, but we haven't done it in a while. So, welcome everybody to the Japan Society of Boston's poetry event that I've been really excited to bring to you. My name is Yuko Handa. I'm the executive director at the Japan Society of Boston. So, for a lot of I see lots and lots of familiar names. Wonderful to see you. I see some new names. Wonderful to have you here. We're very happy that you're all here and spending this time with us. I know August is a hard time to be online, I think, so we really appreciate this. I wanted to share just a little bit of why we're doing this program today. Chris Ellars is our intern. He's been working for us for quite a while now. And one day he shared with me and actually Naoko-san, who is our operations manager, a presentation he did in high school about a topic that is very, very dear and important to him, Japanese poetry. And the presentation was so wonderfully done and so beautifully done. And his energy and love for poetry was so deep and just so genuine and beautiful. I said, Chris, we have to do an event. We have to share your love of Japanese poetry with our audience, for whom I think you all share the love for Japanese poetry with Chris. So here we are. I hope some of you have brought your own haiku or your own waka that you will share with us, because I am hoping that we will have some people share your wakas and haikus, and we definitely have left some time in the end. So without further ado, here is my intern, Chris Ellers. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself? And I think people are ready to delve into your level of Japanese poetry.
Yeah, so hello everyone. As Yuko-san said, my name is Chris. I am not only an intern, but I also am a student at Boston University, where I am a dual degree student between voice performance and Japanese language and literature. And I'm really excited to talk about Japanese poetry with you all today. To me, Japanese poetry, and specifically Japanese classical poetry, is such a beautiful portal to not only the way of life, but the philosophy and perspective of the Japanese people throughout history, because Japanese literature seems to kind of spring from poetry, with many of the most famous pieces of Japanese literature being works of poetry. So I'm really excited. And without further ado, let's get started. So haiku is something that we all should probably be very familiar with. Haiku, for the English versions of haiku, rather, they consist of 3 unrhymed lines of 5, 7, and 5 syllables. I say that this is the English version because in Japanese, they're not necessarily broken down into the line or the syllable, but I'll get to that a little bit later. Haiku is usually represented in the form of haiga, which is depicted right here with this picture, which is the poem featured alongside an image or a pair of images meant to depict the essence of a specific moment in time. Haiku actually originates from Japanese hokku, which is the opening section of a much longer sequence called renga, which is linked poetry in the form of tanka, or 5-lined poetry. Renga is usually composed by 2 different writers. The first 3 lines are composed by one poet, the next 2 by another, and in completion, 3 poets in one sitting would compose about 100 lines in typical renga. Hokku was composed usually by a single poet. Finally, over time, the hokku began to be appreciated for itself and became a more distinct poetic form. To talk a little bit about the relationship between haiku and waka, which I will be talking about waka a little bit later. Waka is a much older form of poetry with its own rules and traditions, whereas haiku, when it was created, was drawn from waka to subvert the tradition. And so as haiku evolved and grew in popularity, the traditions of haiku and waka became intertwined with each other. So we cannot talk about haiku without talking about Matsuo Basho, so let us talk about him. Matsuo Basho was born Matsuo Kinsaku near Kyoto, Japan in the early Edo period, which lasted from 1603 to 1868. He was born to a minor samurai and his wife, and although it is believed that Basho's siblings became farmers, Matsuo Basho lived in Ueno Castle in the service of the son of the local lord, and that is where he grew interested in literature. After the lord's son's early death, Basho left Ueno Castle and moved to Kyoto, where he studied with a distinguished local poet named Kigin. And it is there that Basho studied Chinese poetry and Taoism, and he started writing Haikai no Renga, which uses as its opening verse a hokku. The 17th century, also at this time, saw the beginning of poets taking hokku and transforming it into haiku. Basho first wrote under several pen names, including Tosei, or Green Peach, which was a salute to the Chinese poet Li Po, whose name translates to white plum. In his late 20s, Basho moved to Edo, where he joined a rapidly growing literary community. And it is there, after one of his students gave him a gift of basho trees being banana trees, that is where Matsuo Basho became Matsuo Basho and took that name, discarding Kinsaku. And some of his most notable works are the Nozarashi Kiko, the Oi no Kobumi, the Sarashina Kiko, and the Oku no Hosomichi. So this is arguably Basho's most famous haiku, and it's also arguably the most famous haiku there is, The Old Pond, which reads, Furu ike ya, kawazu tobikomu, mizu no oto, or The Old Pond, a frog jumps in, sound of water. So for my interpretations of these poems, I liked to take the objects or the characters that feature in these poems and kind of break those down and see what they mean in Japanese culture and what they might mean relating to each other in the poem. So to start off, we'll talk about frogs. So in this poem, frog is kawazu, but in Japanese, frog is typically, the word for frog is typically kaeru, which can be spelled multiple ways because kanji have multiple different ways of pronunciation. And so one of the ways that you can spell kaeru actually would mean the verb to return. Therefore, frogs were actually sometimes carried by travelers to make sure that they returned home safely, which is very interesting. And also frogs symbolize good fortune and rain, as they were very plentiful after rainfall. Next, to talk about water. Water in Japanese is mizu. The character can also be read sui. And water symbolizes formlessness in the world, like emotions. And in elemental astrology, sui can also mean plants, which grow from both earth and water, expanding and reaching, but always anchored. It's also important to talk about Buddhist philosophy. Since Basho grew up in Ueno Castle, he would have been inundated by it because the samurai wanted all of their children and everyone to be educated in Buddhism. So Buddhism is less about the external world and more about the internal mind and state of being. So taking that all into consideration, the way that I interpreted this poem is that it is less about the external world and more about, the pond is like our mind, that's what I meant to say, and the frog is like the external world. Our mind easily changes and flows, but in the end, the ripples of life subside and we are left to our own contemplation. So we are all just our minds, and our minds must remain flexible and flowing. The frog could also symbolize returning to our inner thoughts as the frog jumps into the pond. Another thing that we can talk about as well is the sound of the water can be how our thoughts resonate inside ourselves and how they resonate with the external world. So that was my interpretation of this poem. But what Basho himself was trying to do, which is kind of what he was trying to do with the entire genre of haiku, is to take the traditions of Waka and change them into something new that reflected the present day. So he takes a lot of imagery and vocabulary popular in Waka, but then uses them differently. For example, in Waka, traditionally the frog is associated with clear running water, like a river or stream. But Basho is kind of twisting the connotations by referring to an old pond, which would not have been clear. The other thing that Basho is doing is that when frogs are talked about in Waka, they're usually referred to by their sound, like they're croaking. But in this poem, he makes the sound associated with the frog the jumping into the water. So you can kind of see that Basho wants to do something new. Therefore, he's referring to the past, but changing it to kind of breathe new life into poetry as a whole in Japan. So that is that poem.
So Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but do you think Matsuo Basho at his time was a very modern person?
I would think so. He would, if not modern, he was definitely forward thinking. He really wanted to, I guess, maybe less stamp his image on everything, but more just trying to take what already existed and then kind of pushing it forward to explore different aspects of poetry and different themes that Waka might have been doing differently in the past.
So in certain ways, he's a pioneer.
Yeah, I would say so, definitely.
Fantastic.
Cool. So around 1682, after a fire that devastated Edo took his house, Basho began a journey that became the material for a new form of poem he created called haibun. Haibun is a combination of haiku and prose to trace a journey, and haibun imagery mainly follows two paths, one being the external images observed along the way, and the second being the internal images that move through the mind of the traveler during the journey. So I did not analyze this because it would take a very long time and we don't have that much time, but this is a segment of one of Basho's most famous haibun, the Oku no Hosomichi, which I encourage all of you to check out because it's super cool. And you can kind of see that we have the prose part here that ends in a haiku. So that is haibun. Next, I would like to talk about waka. Waka literally translates to Japanese poem. The word was coined in the Heian period, which lasted from 794 to 1185, to separate native poetry from the kanshi, or Chinese poetry. In the beginning, waka was used to describe many different specific types of poetry, including tanka, which is like short poems, and choka, or long poems. But there were many other forms as well, including busokusekika, sedoka, and katauta. Towards the beginning of the Heian period, however, these other forms started to fall into disuse, and eventually even the choka vanished soon after these fell, leaving waka to be more specifically referring to tanka. At this point, it should be clarified that though tanka definitely existed, the term tanka was actually created in the 20th century by poet and critic Masaoka Shiki. In fact, even the term haiku was also coined by Masaoka Shiki. And most terms for specific types of Japanese poetry were created long after they first reached popularity. Most poems were referred to during the time as either waka or haikai. And though the word hoku appeared, it did not reference the whole genre. Waka does not have a sense of rhyme or line, but was categorized into the unit and the phrase, which are changed into lines when they are westernized. So typically, waka have 5 units and 2 phrases with the pattern 5-7-5-7-7. The 5-7-5 is called the kaminoku, or the upper phrase, and the 7-7 is called the shimonoku, or the lower phrase. And in Japanese poetry, you will actually seldom see rhyme schemes. This is because certain aspects, or certain arrangements, I should say, of rhymes, even if they were accidental, would be seen as dire faults in the poem. So because I'm going to be talking about waka specifically from the Heian period, I would like to take this time to talk a little bit about the Heian period to give this context, right? So the Heian period, history and culture, what we know is pretty much surrounded by the imperial court, and the imperial court during this time was all about aesthetics. the two most significant ones being miyabi and mono no aware. Miyabi, which can be translated as refinement or elegance or courtliness, is the removal of all things vulgar or absurd, and mono no aware, or sensitivity, is the ability to be moved by nature, a melancholy over the impermanence of things in this world. Both miyabi and mono no aware needed to be exhibited for anyone to be considered beautiful in Heian Japan. Miyabi and mono no aware were mainly expressed through poetry. Poems were the first and main form of communication between members of the court. Men wrote poems to men, women to women, and lovers and married couples to one another. Poetry was so beloved that competitions were held regularly, and having sensitivity and having referenced proper seasonal and older poetic tropes were most sought after in these poems. A little cultural note here, Heian aesthetic was also expressed through fashion, as is demonstrated by this lovely lady right here. Women wore very long robes, which were called juni hitoe, or 12-layered robes, which were very colorful and extremely complicated, and they could weigh up to 45 pounds. And basically, the more layers one exhibited, the more impressive it was seen as. So, without further ado, let us move on to our first Waka poet, Izumi Shikibu, one of my personal favorites. Izumi Shikibu was a mid-Heian era Japanese poet of Waka who lived in the late 10th century to the early 11th century. Her father was a minor court official named Oeo no Masamune, and Shikibu married twice, becoming the lover of both Prince Tametaka and his brother, Prince Atsumichi. Her poems are a part of a tradition of court love poetry. They frequently combine erotic and romantic longing with Buddhist contemplation. Out of all the Heian poets, she is said to have the most poignant Buddhist sensibility, and her best known work is a diary that charted her 5-year romance with the Prince Atsumichi. She was also a member of the entourage of the Empress Shoshi, also known as Empress Akiko, who was the wife of the Emperor Ichijo. This entourage also included Murasaki Shikibu, who is unrelated, but is the author of Tale of Genji, which is credited for being the first novel written in human history. A little historical note here, this entourage was very strategic. If Shoshi, a member of the Fujiwara clan, was tutored and influenced by these ladies, then she would remain in favor of the emperor. Thus, the clan's influence would be safeguarded. And for the origin of her name, the origin is actually quite interesting. Women, during this time period, unfortunately did not really have a public name beyond their status. And so Izumi Shikibu was known by the name Shikibu, meaning secretariat, which was her father's job. And Izumi was later added on after she married Tachibana no Michisada, the governor of Izumi. If you want to visit her, she is memorialized at Seishinin Temple in central Kyoto. So for her poem, I chose Tachinoboru, which reads, Tachinoboru, kemuri ni tsukete, omou kana, itsumata ware o hito no kakumi. Or, rising to the skies with the smoke I send my thoughts. Sometimes hence I will appear to folk like this. So for context, this poem was written when Shikibu was living in a mountain temple and witnessed a funeral. So because of that, we should talk about funerals in Japan. Japan is a Shinto Buddhist society. Shinto is the religion, and Buddhism is the way of life and like the philosophy. Shinto, or kamiganari, is a religion that worships and celebrates life. Thus, the shrines and the priests and priestesses do not really deal with funerals. This is left to the philosophical contemplation of Buddhism. Japanese Buddhists pray to Amida Buddha for safe passage to the Pure Land, a realm of gold where it is most easy to attain nirvana, which is a Sanskrit word that basically more or less translates to enlightenment, and is the ultimate goal of all Buddhists. Pure Land Buddhism teaches that once you die, your spirit changes name so that it can cut ties with its human past self and transition into the afterlife to embrace its new existence. So for my interpretation of this poem, I said that the smoke could be referencing incense, which is very popular in Buddhist ceremonies and practices, which would have rose to the sky. Thoughts are sent to the heavens in prayer, and like smoke, which lingers, her memory will return to people like this, a faint scent of the past. And so thoughts and memories are kind of like smoke, and the memories of people long past will still remain, which keeps them alive. So I like that poem. So now the last poet that I wanted to talk about is Ono no Komachi. We kind of have to talk about her because she's very famous. Ono no Komachi is an early Heian female Waka poet of unparalleled beauty and renown. She was one of the most famous and well-respected poets of the early Heian period, and remains to be one of the most famous and well-respected poets of Japanese history in general. Her beauty sparked such strong rumors and awe that she left a deep mark on Japan even to this day. Not a whole lot is known about her for sure, but we think she was born around 825 in Dewa, which is now a part of Akita Prefecture in what is now Yuzawa City. Her father, Yoshisada, who was the lord of Dewa, sent his daughter to Kyoto to serve in the imperial court at around the age of 12 or 13. And what we do know is that Komachi definitely excelled in this world, because although poetry brought her the most attention, she was also known for her skills at the koto, calligraphy, singing, and dancing. As a poet, she mainly wrote about love and mainly to her many lovers, and these can actually help us to understand when she was at court. Her poetry is filled with heartache, longing, and emotional intensity. As a little cultural side note, having many lovers was not considered a bad thing in classical Japan, but was actually quite normal. Men and women often had multiple lovers, however, this never lessened the emotional strain. So, Ono no Komachi was the living personification of miyabi, mono no aware, and general overall aesthetic during the Heian period. She was known as an Akita Bijin, or a beautiful woman from Akita or other parts of Tohoku. And the Akita Bijin were very famous because they had very similar qualities of beauty that they all shared. They were said to have white or pale skin, round faces, straight brows, double eyelids, a small nose, and a small mouth with full lips. Ono no Komachi was said to have all of these qualities. And these are two other very famous Akita Bijin, Sotori Hime and Onna-san no Miya or Nyo-san. So the poem that I chose to mainly represent Ono no Komachi is Hananoiroa, which reads, Hananoiroa utsuri ni keri na itazura ni, wagami yo ni furu nagamese shima ni. Or, the color of this flower has already faded away, while in idle thoughts my life goes by as I watch the long rains fall. So you can kind of hear the heartache in that she's famous for. For the flower symbolism, flowers are incredibly important in Japan. There are many important aspects of Japanese culture that are represented by flowers. For example, the emperor sits on the chrysanthemum throne. The lotus symbolizes purity and enlightenment in Buddhism. Sakura, or the cherry blossoms, are the embodiment of wabi-sabi, or the acceptance of and attraction to imperfection. And plum blossoms were the original sign of spring and the original beginner of the hanami, or blossom viewing tradition, and are also associated with good fortune and thought to ward off evil. For rain, Japanese society lived off rain because they were a very agricultural society. Rain was seen as the way by which rice grows, thus rain basically fed the Japanese people. There is even a very important god, actually multiple important gods, one of them being Kuraokami, who is a mythological dragon said to be the god of rain and snow. And many rain dances and festivals were held to try and bring Raijin, the god of thunder, to areas that needed the rain. For this interpretation, I said that Ono no Komachi most likely wrote this poem in contemplation of Buddhist philosophy. We can tell because it highlights the impermanence of the world and coming to terms with this as represented by the fading colors of the flowers, which is something that you see throughout the Buddhist world. She sits contemplating nothing of importance whilst the rains fall, bringing life and meaning to many of her countrymen, but not her. So you definitely can understand the heartache in that. I actually did one more poem by Komachi because I really like this poem. I think it's kind of funny. because this poem was written in response to a poem she received from a man named Abe no Kiyoyuki, who listened to a sermon given by the monk Shinsei at a memorial service and composed the poem, "I may wrap them up, but in my sleeve they will not stay. These white jewels, shed for a lady I cannot glimpse, are my tears." Komachi's response, "Oroka naru, namida zo sore ni tama wa nasu, ware wa sekiaezu, takitsuse nareba." Or, "How hollow are tears upon a sleeve in gemlets, for mine cannot be damned as a surging flood." So basically, tears that are hidden by sleeves are meaningless in passion, whereas true emotions are uncontrolled and flow willingly outward to the external world in force. So she's basically not giving him the time of day, and I think that's really funny. So I have one more poem for you guys, and this is a poem that I wrote called Hikarutsuki. It's a haiku, and it reads, "Hikarutsuki subete o terasu yume ni naru," or "the glowing moon illuminating everything becomes a dream." Yuko-san mentioned that I had done this project originally for high school, and I had done many more poems in that, or I had interpreted many more poems and talked a lot about many more poems in that, but I had to cut this one down for this presentation. And in one of the poems, I talked about the moon. So to talk a little bit about the moon now, the moon in Japanese is tsuki, and it's very important religiously. Shintoism has the moon god Tsukiyomi, who represents dreams, fertility, spirituality, and the balance of masculine and feminine energy. And Buddhism has the moon representing inner enlightenment. So I personally love the moon. So I wanted to write about it with that being my inspiration. That is basically it. I wanted to extend a special thanks to Yuko Handa and Naoko Takeyanagi for allowing me to do this event, and also to Michelle Croson for her mentorship and assistance during this process, as she has a PhD in all of this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. And we've thank you, Laron and Peter, for reminding us that you are absolutely correct in saying that there are variations in the way some of these waka and or haiku can be interpreted. So a quick thing to note that this is absolutely Chris's interpretation of these waka and haiku, but I think as in all other forms of literature, I think that's the beauty of these poems, in that there are multiple ways to interpret, and thus you can get lost in them. So I've seen that in Chris. He's very when he starts talking about Japanese poetry, I can totally see that he's lost in them, which I thought is very beautiful. And I know that not only is Japanese poetry his interest, I believe, Chris, you're pretty much interested in everything Japan, but it is actually encouraging him to really try hard learning Japanese. So I think it's a beautiful way to start his version of the Japan journey, and I'm very happy to be able to share this with you. Now, before I move on to asking if any of you have brought your own haikus or wakas, I also wanted to note that, as Chris mentioned today, we are sharing today classic versions of the Japanese poem. And I just simply wanted to quickly share that there is a thing called, I shouldn't call it a thing, there is a form of poetry called sendyu in Japan. And sendyu, some people call it the cousin of haiku, is follows the same format, 5-7-5, but it's very often more so based on people and real life versus nature. And there is a annual sendyu contest in Japan that is organized by Daiichi Seimei, which is actually an insurance company. I believe it started in the late 1980s, but it's called the Salaryman Sendyu, Salaryman Sendyu. So this is sendyu that people who are businessmen or who are salaried workers submit, and it's actually, I think, a poll, like people vote. And I wanted just to share a modern version, or I don't know if I should call it the modern, but just to share a sendyu, there is a sendyu that won first place in the Sarariman Sendyu 2021. It goes, I'm going to say it in Japanese first. It goes, 会社へは来るなと上司、行けと妻. I would translate that to my office. Don't come, says my boss, but go, says my wife. You know, I thought that one, number one, you know, I mean, obviously this is the pandemic year, but just to show a second, the second sendyu, the sendyu that won second prize. 10万円見ることもなく妻のもの. 10,000 yen without me seeing a penny, it goes to my wife. I would be the way I would translate. There was a whatchamacallit, oh my goodness, I forget the word in English, but there was a government issued 10,000 yen, 1,000 yen, right? 10,000 yen, right? Was issued to every single person in Japan by the governments. And I thought this sendyu, again, Sarariman sendyu, was really interesting because you might be able to see a little glimpse into the role and position of Sarariman in Japan with these two sendyu. So with that said, anybody want to share your haiku or waka? And I really hope some of you have something, because if not, Chris can probably spend the next 30 minutes sharing his own haiku. And as lovely and wonderful of a person Chris is, I'm not too sure if we should give him the full time that we have with each other together. Raise your hand, go ahead and start, or give us in chat. Ooh, we have an interesting question from Peter. Peter says, how do you or other scholars account for the development of the waka form? Why must the waka necessarily be 57577 syllables? Does the form ever vary and have alternate syllable counts? Do you know, Chris, or anybody else who can offer an answer to this?
I don't know. I can say that very confidently because I'm just starting my scholastic journey in Japanese literature, but I think it's a really interesting question. And I think as a musician, I definitely can see how, like, in the music world, we're having a lot of questions being brought up right now that are similar to this in terms of, like, why are the foundations of classical music this way? Why can't we do other things? And I think it brings up a whole lot of new, really beautiful art and music to be shared with the world. So wonderful. That is my response, which is basically I don't know, but.
And I think Reran, you have an answer to this question.
Yeah, it goes back to choka, right? Choka is 5757, alternating to the last two lines are 77. The tanka, which was the response to that, the summary of it, is that form of 57577. That's always where the form is. Chris brought up the sedoka, which is 577 So there were alternate forms floating around in the Nara period. It became solidified largely because of the choka tanka situation, and it develops out of that. Does that mean it's always that way? No. You have the concept of jiamari, which is having one or two syllables over. You're allowed to go one syllable over, two is pushing it, but no more than that. There is a concept of jitarazu, which is too few syllables, but you don't really see it that much. You tend to see maybe one syllable more, that you go 32, that you may go long on one particular section.
Relan, are you a poet?
No, actually, poetry is my discipline of research, right? I have my PhD in classical Japanese literature, specializing on poetry. You mentioned the 36 immortals. That's what my dissertation was on the 36 poetic immortals.
Beautiful, beautiful. May I ask, while I have your attention, what prompted you on your, actually, what started you on your, love for Japanese poetry?
My scholarship, if you want to know kind of where it was, my head, actually, I wanted to be a Genji scholar. Ooh. So I read Genji in high school and actually read the larger scientific translation of Genji and fell out of love with it after reading that. Then I jumped over to the tale of the Heike, and then I moved over to poetry and have stayed ever since. So yeah, my research is really more about that interaction as much as that Waka kanshi. It's in scholarship, we're trying to break what we call the Wakan dialectic, that assumption that Waka and kanshi never interacted. You have things like the Wakando issue, which is the collection of songs that were chanted in Chinese and Japanese. So these are couplets of Chinese poetry and Waka poems that were all sung. So to go to Chris's point of music, it's poetry and music. And that goes back to the basic concept of poetry in Japanese is uta. Mm-hmm. But uta is also the word for song, right? So there's always a deep connection between poetry and music in the Heian period because of that notion that poetry, music are both defined by uta, which are song and poetry.
Love it. Love that you shared that with us. Actually, this is probably a wonderful time for me to say that at the Japan Society of Boston, we are planning on launching a uta no kai, sort of like a uta club instead of a book club, where people can get together, bring their haikus, their wakas, their tankas, their senryus. But I thought, I don't see anywhere, at least I am not aware of anywhere where people can bring in their songs, Japanese songs. And there are a lot of uta no kai, or sometimes it's also called a kukai, haiku kukai in Japanese. But instead of a book club, I see more of a uta no kai or kukai in Japan. So I thought I'll bring it on to our online audience. We'll start a kukai or a uta no kai. So if you didn't bring your haiku or waka with you today, there will be lots of occasions for you to bring to us. I'm hoping that this will be sort of like a monthly sort of uta no kai, and I there's something in me that says I would be reaching out to Leron-san and be like, Leron-san, you have to come as a guest. But I hope all of you would look forward to that. With that said, anybody else who, it can be a sharing of your waka, sharing of your haiku, sharing of if senryu, or just a thought. I mean, I wanted this as a little bit different from our normal event format. I really wanted this to be a very casual corner where, we can all talk about our interest in poem. As a matter of fact, I hope, Remy, it's okay for me to share in person. Remy says, I remember I once read a book of Japanese death poems, which cataloged poems on death written by poets as they were dying. I don't have any particular poems in mind, but I am very interested in that genre of Japanese poetry in particular. Thank you for sharing that, Remy. Anybody else you can share it in chat and I would read. Oh, I love it. Thank you, Vera. You say your poetry is packed and unpacking soon. I love that. And yes, now we will have a platform, or actually you will have a platform where you can share your Japanese poems in the future. And I'm very excited to be starting this. I know I have a few other staff from the Japan Society of Boston. Any of you want to share your relationship with Japanese poems? Or as a matter of fact, this is where I'm going to put my Japanese colleague on the spot and say, Naoko-san, share with us, like, I'm not too sure if you have a waka or a haiku to share, but maybe you can share with us your relationship to poems as you grew up in Japan. And maybe you have none, and that's okay too.
I have to say, Chris has much more passion than I do. I did have to write a few as an assignment when I was growing up and schooling, but I do enjoy reading the Salaryman Senryu, I have to say. It's usually published in a newspaper as well.
And am I right about the utanokai or kukai, as we say in Japanese, that there's lots of it around us?
Yes, and especially, for example, if during the cherry blossom seasons, you might see people walking around with a piece of paper because they're like trying to come up with a waka or haiku as they look at the cherry blossoms. So if you see people with a piece of paper writing something down, chances are they belong to a kukai.
Same goes for foliage season, I think. I'm going to put, oh my goodness, Peter is going to get mad at me later, but I am going to put Peter Grilli on the spot and ask Peter your relationship with Japanese poems.
Like Naoko, I really do feel that I'm being put on the spot because I don't know that I have a particular relationship with Japanese poetry, except to say that I've read many poems, many Japanese poems. I've tried to translate on occasion Japanese waka or haiku, never with much success. At least I wasn't satisfied with my translations. And I think that leads me just to comment on how, and Chris touched on this, in a way, how loose the meanings of Japanese poetry are. They're so short, they're so terse, but they can be interpreted in so many different ways. That's why I mentioned earlier on that the Furuikeya, the old pond poem of Basho's, has been translated into English at least 150 times, published translations 150 times. And when you think for a 17-syllable, very fragile poem like that, to have that many interpretations and that many possible translations is really an extraordinary thing, because those 17 syllables are open to such a broad variety of meanings and interpretation. I don't know of any other poetic form that is as flexible and as broad as that. I don't know whether Chris would agree with that or not, but I think haiku are absolutely unique in the world of poetry for being accessible to so many different interpretations. One other thing that I just want to mention, and again, I don't know of another country where this phenomenon existed, but the Asahi Shimbun, which is one of Japan's major newspapers with circulation of millions and millions and millions of people, the Asahi Shimbun for decades had on its front page, and maybe it still does, I don't know, but had on its front page a small box which was devoted to a poem by one of Japan's most, this column was written by one of Japan's most distinguished poets, Oka Makoto. And the thought of millions and millions of people every morning opening the newspaper and reading a poem. And Oka sensei had a short commentary for that poem. They weren't all his poems. He selected them from throughout Japanese poetry. But the thought of millions of people every morning opening their morning newspaper and reading a poem and thinking about a poem, to me, that says something about the Japanese personality, Japanese soul, because I don't know, it would put anyone, I think, in a very special frame of mind to begin every day contemplating a work of poetry, a classical work of poetry, or a modern work of poetry. It's amazing.
Peter, you bring back a wonderful memory of my childhood. My family was one of those millions and millions of people subscribing to the Asahi Shimbun. And as it would come, my mom would read the poetry section first, and I was very excited to read the comic section first as a kid. So yes, you are correct. Yes, I do. My mother passed away a long time ago, but you brought a beautiful memory back about how she was always reading the poetry first, and I was more excited as a kid to read the comic section first. One thing that I don't know if it's related, maybe it's completely unrelated, something that Peter, you reminded me of now that I live in the United States and I have this wonderful opportunity to be able to go back and forth between these two cultures. Sometimes I think that there are limitations. I'm not too sure if I should call limitation, but there are limitations in Japanese cultures that do not exist in America. I think America, in many ways, is a more liberating, free place. Just really simply, for example, I think there is a tighter, for example, expectation of the society for certain people to be a certain way in Japan, for example. That's just an example. But I'm wondering if that forces, in certain ways, because there are limitation, in this case 575 or 57577, that it kind of forces people to be creative, that it really, not only gives you flexibility in certain ways, but it also forces one to be very creative. I'm just wondering, because sometimes I do feel that sometimes it's within those limitations that you learn to be very creative. So just my personal observation, one person's observation, and I see. Actually, Jane has a question. I know you say it's for later, but do you think Chris will be willing to share his slide deck? And Chris, we would be happy to share your presentation material with people if they want to have them, right?
Absolutely. This is for anybody and everybody.
I feel that Chris spent his original presentation, as he mentioned, was much longer. I feel like he has not only shortened his presentation for us, but also refined it. Chris, I was very impressed with the way you refined it. You did a lot of research, some of which, thank you, Liron, for clarifying. Thank you, Peter, for adding. But I'm sure he would be very happy if any of you would be interested in taking it with you and then rereading those haikus and wakas. I'm sure Chris would be very, very excited.
Yeah,
Now,
thank you. It went very fast, so I need to study more carefully.
fantastic. Tanisha sent us a comment that says, I watched an animated movie called Night on the Galactic Railroad. It's based on one of Mr. Kenji Miyazawa's poems, which also reminds me of how, Peter, thank you for reminding me. I feel that this is not a comparison of US Japan, so please don't take it that way. But I do feel that although I did not grow up in a family where we had a lot of poets in the house, I feel like poems were abundant. I don't know how else to explain it, but a good example is, I think a lot of people in Japan, for example, knows about the Sarariman Senryu, right? Even if you have nothing, like even if you really don't like literature, if you don't read, if you don't like poems, but I think it's in people's minds. And I do feel like there were many, many occasions where poems felt very close to me. And that's probably because it's used in movies, as Tanisha mentions, or it's used in places where you don't associate. Is the impression I get of poetry. Although I also have to say, just to let you know, to be honest, when I was studying American poetry, when I was in high school, I did not like poetry at all. And I actually really suffered through that, couple of weeks that we had to cover poems. And yet I came to love it as an adult. I now actually read American poems a lot, and I carry actually a book of poems with me all the times, which actually, just to share with you, have opened up my road to Japanese poetry. So you never know how the world, how your road winds up. Despite the fact that I grew up with a lot of Japanese poetry around me, it took me American poems in my adulthood to go back and really look at Japanese poems. So um, this isn't about me. I feel like I've been talking a lot. Any comments, wakas, haikus that anybody, or any thoughts in Japan that anybody wants to share with us?
Well, if we can I'll kind of drop something that came up in the scholarly discussions, and my advisor who's retired, Steve Carter, who's now retired, brought this up as he was kind of leaving out of the scholarly world. But one of the things that he raised the question of is, when do you call a poem a poem? And the question of, we're used to seeing poems written down, especially coming from the Western tradition, we're used to seeing poems being written down. But for those scholars of us who deal with the poetry, who deal with Waka poetry, it's a question that kind of came up with, is a sense of, it seems like there's an oral element to it. It needs to be spoken. And so if you just write it down, that's one thing. And definitely by the 12th century, you had kind of, when the compiling instinct was going on, you had poets submitting kind of long sequences of poems for inclusion in the imperial anthologies. But again, if we're going back to that basic notion of uta as a song, and poetry as song, it has to be sung. It's not just simply to be written down. It really doesn't gain anything from being written down, just like a song lyric can be written down. It's when it's sung, when it's spoken, that it really becomes a song. And so he really did leave, as he was going out the door, with that question of, okay, we're used to reading it, especially as non-Japanese scholars of this field, and we're used to seeing it in books. But at the time, these things were supposed to be recited, right? So that question of orality is something that we as scholars of Waka poetry are tackling with. So
that is beautiful. And I'm so sorry this becomes a promotion of our event again, but Laurent-san, more reason why people should come to our kukai or utakai and sing their poems with us, so that we can sing these poems together. Naoko-san just sent me a direct message right now and said, mine is really, really shiroto. Shiroto is what, non-professional, but do you think I can share my waka I wrote? And I said, yes, please. So here comes Naoko-san with her haiku.
Well, it's actually a haiku that I wrote in English for the first time. So it was a challenge because instead of the actual letters, you have to do it by syllables, right? So I wasn't prepared to share this one. Here we go. So I had to write about this ceramic piece from Paco Gallery. So I hope everybody can see it, but it was my first attempt, so.
Can you also sing it for us?
Well, okay. It wasn't rehearsed, but sleek onyx glaze plate resembles cherry tree bark. Reminds me of home.
Oh, that is beautiful. Thank you for singing that for us. Actually, talking of singing, I think I read the send you in a certain way, if you have noticed, because that's how I have always heard it. So Reron-san, wonderful for you to remind me of that too. And there's also a kukai that the imperial family organizes or does every year, right? Which is definitely sung every year. So lots to discuss in our future program. I think we have a comment from Tia. There is also the tanka from the Garden of Words movie and some of the sillier haiku from Avatar. TLA. It seems that other media can help with exposing others to poetry. So true, so true. And yes, thank you, Jane-san, for sharing some of the Sarariman Senryu. Sarariman Senryus are often, I think, more very directly people's lives oriented. So like I said, of the two poems that I read about the Sarariman, you can imagine what kind of, life these Sarariman have at home. But with that said, I think we are unfortunately at the end of our program. Chris, if you could share some of our upcoming events. So we
Yes, I
have,
can.
thank you. We have two extremely exciting upcoming events coming up. This is going to be in collaboration with the Japan America Society of Chicago. And that in itself is extremely exciting because this will be our first collaboration with the society, the Japan America Society of Chicago, but we will be talking about two pioneers, Japanese pioneers in the United States. They are set to be one of the first people to have come to the US. Now, the first one is going to be on Umeko Tsuda. This is going to be next Wednesday, the 25th from 8 p.m. our time. So if you haven't registered yet, and if you are free, please register. This is going to be very interesting. Tsuda Umeko, I believe, came to the United States in 1870 something. Actually, I think I have the correct date. She came in 1871. I was great. 1871. She was 7 when she came, and when she returned to Japan, she was 18. When she returned to Japan, she didn't speak a word of not. I shouldn't say word, but she didn't speak Japanese because from 7 to 18 she was in the United States. She was one of the 5 women that were a part of the group that was commissioned by the Meiji government. The Meiji government was the government that was trying to open up Japan after Japan was opened up after Commodore Matthew Perry came to Japan with his black ship Kurofune. And she ultimately in Japan started Tsudajuku Daigaku, who is a women's college. She partially probably because she went to Bryn Mawr, which is also a women's college in the United States. So the president of Tsuda College will be sharing with us some of the stories of her journey to the US. So she is said to be probably the first woman to have come to the United States. Now, a month after that, on September the 23rd from 7 p.m. our time, we will be talking about John Manjiro, who is said to have been the first Japanese man to have come to the United States. I believe it was in 1843, and I hope I'm correct. But John Manjiro was actually shipwrecked off of an island in Japan, and he was picked up by an American whaling ship captain, Captain Whittemore, and the president of the Whittemore Manjiro Friendship Committee, who runs the museum in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, is going to be sharing with us the story of John Manjiro. Can you imagine coming to the United States, 1843? But he is said to be really the first pioneer, the first Japanese person to come to the United States. When he went back to Japan, Japan was still sakokuchu. They were still closed up to the rest of the world. So he was actually jailed because back then when people would leave, they were criminals. So he was jailed, but he is said to have been particularly important in the negotiations and in the opening up of Japan. He was the translator for Commodore C. Perry, although he could not see him in person. but he did translate all the documents. Rooney-san, like I said, will be sharing the story of John Manjiro. So this is a 2-part series of the first Japanese pioneers to the United States. August 25th, next Wednesday, and September 23rd, which I don't remember which day of the week, but September 23rd at 7 p.m. Along with this, I have to say, we will be releasing 2 episodes of our My Japan Journey podcast. If you haven't listened to our My Japan Journey podcast, please look it up. If you go to anywhere you get your podcasts, really, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and search up My Japan Journey. We have 3 up already. The first one is Susan Napier, second one is Andy Gordon, and third one is Jennifer Weisenfeld. And although some of you may know them in the scholarly circles, you may not know where their Japan journey started. The one we will be releasing very shortly will be Maria Toyoda, who is the provost of Western New England University, and George Rose, who is the translator for New York Yankees. And they both have very interesting way that their Japan journey has started. So look forward to these new episodes. It should be released within the next month. September is the time, probably early September and late September is the time we'll be releasing these 2 podcasts. So with that said, once again, thank you very much for spending this time with us. I know this is summertime and there's other things you can be doing outside. So we appreciate that you spent this time inside with us. Keep us in your mind. We have very, very exciting programming coming that I quite can't share yet, but there's one in November that's coming up that is going to be particularly, I think, interesting for all of you. And now this is my way to say, subscribe to our newsletter, because that's where you will get all of these information. Once again, thank you for coming, and we cannot wait to see you soon in our future programs. Thank you.